দর্শক সবাইকে স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি মুখোমুখি অনুষ্ঠানে। আপনাদের সাথে আছে আমি জিনিয়া কবি সূচনা। আজ আমরা মুখোমুখি হয়েছে এমন একজনের যিনি মাত্র 25 বছর বয়সে একজন সাংবাদিক হিসেবে বাংলাদেশের 1971 সালে যে মুক্তিযুদ্ধ হয়েছিল সেটি কাভার করতে এসেছিলেন এবং তার কাছে সেই সময়কার এমন সব দুর্লভ ছবি আছে যে ছবিগুলো এর আগে কেউই কখনো দেখেনি। আমাদের সাথে আছেন সেই ফরাসি সাংবাদিক অ্যান্ডি হেনিং। আমরা আজ কথা বলবো তার সাথে। ওয়েলকাম টু আওয়ার শো।
Thank you for inviting me to your show.
Thank you. Actually, first question of mine. How did you first come to know of Bangladesh genocide?
I got to know of Bangladesh at the beginning of the conflict because I was in Nepal and I read a dispatch from a French news agency, AFP, and I saw that the head of the bureau chief of the New Delhi bureau was here, was in Calcutta, and that fighting had erupted and that the military, the authorities, Pakistani authorities, had closed the country to members of the press. So I was, as I say, I was in Kathmandu at the time. It was very easy. I decided immediately to come down and I said, well, if they're closing the country to the press, there is something to hide, obviously. And I had heard also there were rumors of massacres. So I came down to Calcutta and I tried to enter the country. First a couple of times by Jessore, but I was turned back. Then I realized maybe it would be better to get into a team, and I went and organized a small sort of incursion into Bangladesh with the AP correspondent, Dennis Neal, Patrick Forrest from CNN, and Michel Laurent, who was a photographer for Gamma. So we rented a run-down car, took 3 jerry cans of petrol, and we left one early morning from Calcutta and went up the border further north in Calcutta, and we managed to convince the border security forces to let us in, to let us cross the border into Bangladesh. And the first sign of the conflict we ran into was a small observation post, sort of makeshift bamboo, and there was a tall bamboo pole flying the Bangladesh flag, the one where you had the outline of the country. And some freedom fighters came out. They didn't have much of an equipment. They had old rifles, and they didn't have much of a uniform either, but they stepped out and they said, welcome, you are now in free Bangladesh. And from there on, we proceeded to Chwadanga. There was a headquarters for a Southwest Command, and we were briefed by Major Ashabul Haq Jorder, who showed us a map, and he briefed us on the progression of the Mukti Bahin and the progression of the Pakistani army. We were taken around the town, and we saw some places that had been shelled by Pakistani saber jets. And then we proceeded on with a jeep at night, and we reached Kustia. And in Kustia, again, we were taken around town, and namely there was a jail where some Pakistani military were held because they had attacked the town some days earlier, but they had been repulsed. And one person who was behind bars, very dignified, he said, we didn't realize we were hated that much on this side. And also in the road, the streets, there were some dead animals, and there were some patrols of the Mukti Bahini in trucks, and there weren't jeeps or any military material of that kind. But we could see the trace of the marks of fighting. And again, at the Kustia there would be a major battle again on the 11th of April after I had returned to Calcutta. Now the aim of that trip was of course to break the ban, the blackout on news, but it was of course to go very quickly in and very quickly out. Otherwise there was no point. So it was as fast as we could, we went from one place to the other and found out about the situation. And
at that time, have you heard of Mujibur Rahman's clarion call for freedom known as March 7?
I knew about the freedom movement, of course, and I knew the situation in South Asia fairly well. I knew about the partition. I knew about the two Pakistan that were separated by 1,000 miles. I knew about the independence movement and the language movement. As I told you, I was in Nepal, but I had been in India before that and some years early as well. So I knew about the situation, I mean, at least some of the situation. As I said, the aim was to get into the country and get the news out as quickly as possible. And where we stopped in some towns and we moved mostly by train, the train station was sort of full of, you know, a crowd would gather and they would shout Joy Bangla, and they would tell us, you must convey to the world our need for modern military equipment. And at some point, a young man came onto the, climbed into the train in our compartment, and he said, I've just come from Dhaka. He was sort of really under shock. He said, my professors have been killed. 17 of my friends have been killed. They're raping women. You must help us, and you must send us help from abroad, from your countries. Ask them to help us.
And what drives you to put your life at risk for capturing the operation by Pak army on a nation that was supposed to be quite unknown to you?
Well, if you see war report, I'm not a war reporter. I mean, I've covered a little bit Vietnam for months or so or more, and then I came to Bangladesh. But when you decide to convey the news of major events to the world, or then you either you don't go to war, or you decide to specifically go there, especially when you're not allowed to do it. If you're not allowed to do something, it's like a kid. You don't want me to do it, I'm going to do it, I'm going to show you. And there was something to hide. And when you have something to hide, then generally it's not nice. And if you want to, it's not because it's not your country, you will do it anywhere. That's what you're supposed to do. That's how you feel about it. Now, if you say, weren't you afraid, weren't you scared, then you don't do it. You go and, I don't know, photograph flowers or, whatever. But when you want to sort of document some major events, well, a war is a major event, and an independence war is even more of an event. And I knew about the independence movement, and I thought this is a major event, and maybe the country is going to be independent, and that's history in the making. Yeah.
And what did you really find on the battlefield during your stay to photograph? Can you tell about any incident part of the genocide that left this important on you while you worked?
Well, I didn't witness, of course, any of the killing. But as I tell you, this young man who came in our compartment, he told us about it, and he had just seen it a few days before. There were some other very striking scenes. When we were in Pangsha, I was taken to a field where you had some men, young boys, practicing fighting with bows and arrows. Do you imagine? 1971, practicing fighting with bows and arrows, and they were ready to fight to the last. They said, we're ready to fight to the last to achieve the liberation of the country, the independence of the country. Yeah. And in another photograph that's in Kustia, you have a young man, he's wrapped in a lungi, he's bare-chested, and he has an old Lee Enfield 303 rifle slung across his shoulder, a little wicker basket to carry his belongings.
Young man, and she's just,
yes,
saw your
you
photograph.
Saw it like that. And did you see it? You can feel, how he's walking briskly, he's going obviously to join his combat
emotion.
unit. Yeah. So all this was extremely encouraging anyhow. And I have the choice to go, I had the choice to leave. The people who stay, who were going to fight, they were there to stay, and they were risking their lives much more than I was.
In your opinion, what really drove freedom fighters to fight back then mighty Pak army?
Well, independence is a good reason to fight, and that's what they wanted, because there was no other way to achieve to be acknowledged. The elections in December had not been acknowledged. Democracy was denied to the Bangladeshi people. The way they could achieve it was through fighting, and I would be motivated if I had been in their place. You know, Sheikh Mujib won the elections. He was entitled to lead the country.
Yeah. How did you come to know of Bangladesh victory?
Oh, that was everywhere in the news because in April no one went much. I mean, there were people who tried to go into the country, but my group was the first one. But then the international press got involved, and there were millions of refugees. By April or May, I think there were 10 million refugees had reached India. So that became a big issue. And of course, it was all over the world. And then Malho wanted to constitute an international brigade, the way he had done during the Republican War in Spain in the late 30s. So it became a sort of world. It captured the world's attention. And then later on, of course, with the Indian army, you know, joined in, and with their help, within a week, 10 days, you know, victory was achieved.
Can you tell us memorable part on your first visit on independent Bangladesh in 1972?
So 1972, I was in Calcutta. I was photographing in Calcutta, and I had a friend who was covering, I think he was AFP correspondent, and we communicated, and he said, you know, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman is going to give a major speech in Dhaka, and you should come. Well, you know, I flew to Dhaka, and it was a year to the day that I had entered Bangladesh. So it was like 7th April, it was 7th April. It was the first Awami League Council, and there was a huge crowd attending. They were very silent, they were listening, you could see with intensely to his words, and he was extremely charismatic. He had very vigorous gestures, he was strong, and his voice carried out very well. And then also what I liked is that when he stopped talking, he would sit down on stage and he would fill his pipe, start smoking the pipe, taking a glass of water, taking notes. But you could see that he was doing that, but he was also listening to what was going on. And I liked the switch from these intimate moments to the public moments, strictly public moments when he was addressing the crowd.
Then you saw the first Council of Bangladesh.
Well, I saw the meeting that took place on that occasion. The council must have been, you know, behind closed door.
Okay, can you tell us about your interaction with Mujib during 1972 visit to Bangladesh?
I didn't have any. I'm a photographer, and sometimes people ask, you know, didn't you talk, didn't you address, didn't you talk to the soldier who was walking? No, when you photograph, you're strictly, I mean, this gentleman must know, your eyes,
you have to have
it's in your camera,
yeah.
And you're framing, you're composing, you want to get the mood of an event or the atmosphere or the personality of someone, and you hear the sound, I mean, but you don't listen really to the words.
Yeah, yeah.
So
we know. Now, after 50 years down memory lane, how do you find this Bangladesh?
Well, change, but obviously any country would change in 50 years. When I came at the time of Sheikh Mujib's speech, there were no high-rise building. All the houses were sort of like private houses, 2 stories, maybe 3. And I didn't stay very long, so I wouldn't be able to tell you how much, you know, what Dhaka was really like in that time. But certainly very different from what I have seen in these past days. And I must say that sometimes I'm asked why I didn't come in the last 50 years, but there was no event that asked for my presence or for, you know, that called for my coming to photograph. But I was very happy in a way, because 50 years later, I came back on Victory Day. My plane was delayed. I missed the connection in Bahrain. Instead of arriving on the 15th, I very aptly arrived on Victory Day on the 16th of December. So, you know, the war, early conflict in 1971, major speech in 72, and Victory Day 50 years later. But Victory Day, the 50th Victory Day, of course.
Yeah. How would you feel about this exhibition that put your photographs on display after almost 5 decades?
That's a miracle. It's a miracle, It's thanks to the Samdani Art Foundation. They wanted to do a celebration for the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh independence, and they heard that I had photographs of Sheikh Mujib. So they asked the person whether she could put us in touch, and then they called me and they asked me whether indeed I had photographs of Sheikh Mujib, and I had a series of portraits. And I went into my archives and I found that they were extremely well preserved. So I said, yes, I have photographs of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman taken in 1972. And then they said, they asked, do you have any other photographs of Bangladesh? I said, yes, I was there in 1971. Oh, can we see them? So that's how it came to be a show, because you had 1972, the portraits of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and then there were these photographs taken in the early days of the conflict. And actually, if you had only one and not the other, whether one way or the other, it wouldn't be a whole a whole story the way they do.
Why your throwback images never been exhibited? Why?
Okay.
Why your throwback images never
yeah.
been exhibited publicly before?
At that time, they were news photographs. There was no digitizing. You had rolled film, you had to process it, you had negatives, you had slides. They were distributed, they were published in a daily or in a monthly, and then they were archived, either in a news agency or in your own archives. But there they were, and no one could sort of have access to them or even know they existed. So one doesn't realize that after being published on the spot, news disappeared. 50 years later, the news becomes history. That's what I found out, it's amazing. If they hadn't been found, they would have stayed and would have been forgotten news. Suddenly they're out and they're seen here, first at the Shilpa Kala Academy, then now at the Liberation War Museum, and also in a major museum in Paris, which has the largest collection of Asian art in the West. It's the Musée Guimet. And it's on show since October. It will be on show until end of January. And it brings the opportunity to the French people and to find out about the history of Bangladesh. And it was open during Art Basel, so there were people coming from all over Europe and all over the world. And those who went to Guimet found out about your history. Otherwise, they wouldn't.
How did you view Awami League's first council in 1972 as you flew to Dhaka to capture the council?
Well, I came to Dhaka to see Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. The Awami League Council, I knew I wouldn't understand his speeches, but I came to see the man and photograph him. So that's strictly what I came to do. It's to photograph the man who had led you and led his country to independence.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you
You're
so
most
much
welcome.
for being a part on our show.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me, and it's wonderful to be here today.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
অ্যান্ডি হ্যানিংয়ের মুখোমুখি হয়ে আমরা অনেক কিছু জানলাম, যে সময়ের কথা আমরা গল্পে শুনেছি, যেটি আমরা এখন তার ছবির মধ্যে দিয়ে অনেক কিছু জানতে পারছি, অনেক কিছু দেখতে পাচ্ছি, এবং এটি আসলে এই প্রজন্ম থেকে প্রজন্মে কিন্তু তার ছবি সাক্ষী দেবে সেই সময়কার, যে ছবিগুলো এর আগে কখনোই আমরা দেখিনি। আজকের মতো বিদায় নিচ্ছি আমাদের মুখোমুখি অনুষ্ঠান থেকে। ভালো থাকবেন।